Thank you very much, Ollie. To any of the parents who have children in secondary school, don't worry, there's still time for them to break records and be awesome. So don't feel the pressure. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this rather wet tent. We were talking earlier about AI solving all the world's problems, but maybe not rain yet. So if any of you are looking for a problem to solve, then that's definitely a very big one. So I'm Imafidon, as Ollie said. I run an organisation called Stemettes, but I'm also wearing my hat today as a trustee for the Institute for the Future of Work. And that's very, very relevant to the topic that we're going to be covering, the fourth industrial revolution. What does it mean for the economy and the charity sector? I'm, of course, joined by Andy Haldane here for the Bank of England, who's going to introduce himself.
Happy to, Anne-Marie. Morning, everyone. So it's just what I do for a living. So by day at the Bank of England as the chief economist, as you've heard. By night, I chair the government's Industrial Strategy Council, which looks at all questions around productivity and innovation. And then while I'm asleep, I'm thinking about the charity sector as the founding trustee of this charity called Pro Bono Economics, which basically takes nerdy economists like me and puts them into the charitable sector to help them evaluate their impact. So I think today, Anne-Marie, we'll probably touch upon all three bits.
Yeah,
public,
private and third sector. And we're going to do a bit of a tour around all of them, because when we talk about the economy, when we talk about society, those are the three things that are part of it. With the fourth industrial revolution in particular, I think it's going to be exciting today to go and look at kind of beyond the private sector, because a lot of the discussions that go on, especially in the work we're doing, the future of work, we're kind of looking at work in private sector. But of course, there's a lot of opportunities for the public sector, and then of course the third sector is just what we're going to kind of major on. So if we start with the private sector, we've got a number of different things that are always touted. You know, automation is going to come, it's going to take jobs, you know, we're going to change business models. What for you would you say are the kind of the two main implications for the private sector of what we're seeing coming with the fourth industrial revolution?
Yeah, so what's absolutely clear, I think, and becomes clearer with each day that passes, is the scale of the opportunity economically. So we know that each of the three previous industrial revolutions led to a huge leap forward in living standards. We know that because, you know, prior to the first industrial revolution, living standards had stood still for millennia. And with the dawn of the first, we saw living standards take off, and they've risen, 20-fold over the period since. So potential huge. But we also know that that innovation needs managing.
Exactly.
If it is to not to tear the social fabric, and if it is to reach all industries and all workers quickly enough. So, I mean, 2 points maybe that speak to that. One would be on the diffusion side. So a lot, I imagine, at CogX and more generally about the innovation frontier being pushed outwards, which it plainly is at a rate of knots. But as importantly, we need to think about the mechanisms, the infrastructure through which that innovation diffuses across sectors, across regions.
And we have to be proactive in controlling those mechanisms as well.
That needs managing.
Yeah.
So, you know, technological trickle-down takes forever. And if anything, over the last 20 or 30 years, that trickle has dried up completely. We've seen the frontier companies charging ahead, but if anything, the long tail drifting ever further behind. And that means that we can't afford just to wait for others to catch up. We need to find actively, proactively, means of enabling them to catch up. Now, of course, CogX is one such diffusion infrastructure. We need them everywhere, not just in King's Cross, but right across the UK. If the huge fruits of innovation are to find their way into company productivity and into pay packets across all sectors and across all regions.
And it's productivity, and it's the pay packets, and it's for all kinds of people, which I think is something that I am more and more concerned about the more that we look into this. When you talk about the innovation and who's gaining, there are a lot of people that are losing out.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that we're seeing even in this transition of kind of jobs and the way the workforce is made up, where there are certain groups that are being left behind, there are certain groups who those benefits aren't being passed on to. So one of the things we're looking at is employee ownership as well of these companies.
Yep.
So then a lot of that money is redistributed as well, kind of equally. So we have that improvement for everyone across the workplace, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly different models of ownership speak to some of this. But just finding ways of digitally connecting that long tail. In some ways, this need not involve, I mean, it's scary if you are a small business, maybe away from a big city, thinking about how do I haul myself up in innovation terms. I think enabling them not necessarily to jump to the moon to reach best practice instantly, but at least to adopt good practice. I mean, that really for me is the name of the game. More so here in the UK than in any other Western country. There is a wide divide between the technological best and the rest. And that divide has widened over the last 10 years. Finding ways of bridging that great technological divide is, for me, one of the keys when it comes to questions of inequality, when it comes to questions of disconnection, when it comes to questions of disaffection with how societies are working for people.
And for anyone that wants to look into that more, Lloyd's has been publishing their digital indexes over the last couple of years. So that's a great resource, actually, if you want to be able to see the quantity and the scale of the issue. And they're looking specifically at digital skills, but they've done that for consumers, for small businesses, and kind of wider different groups that they have. So there is quite a long tail. I think it's also important, given what I do, to ensure that we're motivating people to do that as well. Yep. So I think there's elements of, we all need to do it, but you have to look at the motives and the motivations for people of kind of being able to sit out from this. So sometimes it is about them having the digital capability, but others that they've particularly identified with the Lloyd's report is that there's quite a resistance.
Yep.
So that's quite important. But I think when we look at the kind of the positives, one of the bigger ones for the private sector, and one that comes up often alongside universal basic income, is the 4-day workweek. Which I don't know how many of you here would like to have a 4-day work week. Who's living in 3019 and already has a 4-day work week? So it's something that's kind of been touted quite a lot. When we look at these benefits and the kind of the progression of the revolution and all the good things that are coming out of it, the 4-day work week is one that kind of bubbles up quite often.
But, and more so over time, and rightly so. I mean, the truth is, it's not so long ago, like 100 years ago, when the normal was a 6-day working week. And weekends lasted 1 day rather than 2. That's only a few generations ago.
Hands up if you've gone back in time and do a 6-day working week. Okay, there we go.
And
we're part of the long tail.
We're part of the long tail. Well, I mean, it does split. I mean, in terms of the working week, on average, that's been falling, actually pretty rapidly, for at least 200 years. But it does split a bit between different cohorts of the population. And for some sectors and some skill cohorts, the working week's been nudging up rather than going down over time. Nonetheless, if the pattern of the last 200 years is replicated, and it might be sped up, then we'll be looking at a 4-day working week for the average person by around the middle of the century. And just less than 100 years ago, a famous British economist, the most famous British economist actually, John Maynard Keynes, predicted that by this stage we'd all be working 15-hour weeks. Another economic forecast that was wrong, but what Keynes got wrong was the timing, but not the trend. Because on current trends, we'll probably get to Keynes's 15-hour working week around the tail end of this century. So coming soon, and that begs the question, how will given that working lives over the same period of time, over the next 20 or 30 years, will be expanding, we'll be looking at 100-year lives and 60 or 70-year careers, at the same time as our working week will be shrinking from 32, 33 hours to perhaps 25 hours, that's going to give us a big surplus, spare set of hours to do something with. And the big question is, what we do with those hours?
Yeah, what would you do with those hours? So that's a little bit about the private sector. If we move across slightly to the public sector, how will the fourth industrial revolution affect that differently from how we're forecasting it is for the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen after every previous industrial revolution that the state has had to reinvent itself. Actually, after the first industrial revolution, in the middle of the 18th century, the state had to invent itself, actually. And it's been reinventing itself after every subsequent industrial revolution. This one will be no different. So there will be a big question, you've hinted at it already, Anne-Marie, about what do we mean by the social safety net in future. There'll be a big question about what we mean by the educational system in future. We know that lifelong learning will need to move from being a slogan to being a reality. What role does the state play in facilitating that transition? And one area I think that is ripe for thinking about in a pretty revolutionary way, actually, is the use that the state makes of big data. Because truth be told, the state is one of the biggest current repositories of big data on us, on all of us, our behaviors, our spending, our income, our health. And that administrative data right now is not really being fully utilized, brought together to help in the framing of policy. And I think that could be...
It's happening, it's beginning. I think
at the margins.
To Gov UK's credit, I think there's been a big push to open up data sets and to release them and to ensure that there's kind of access for people to do good with them. I know in London, I think we've got that, there's a lot of work that's been done in that space, but it's not necessarily common practice or even something that's been adopted widely. But the infrastructure's there, right? We're not far off that maybe being more of a reality.
So you're right, the Open Data Initiative has taken a long way forward in this country.
Yeah.
But it's not fully in the bloodstream of every government department. We have not begun the process, which is crucial, for splicing and matching together these different databases to tell a joined-up story about people's life history and lifestyles. So if you go somewhere like Denmark, where they've had these data for years and years and years, and they are fully joined up, that is used as the very bedrock of the setting of social and economic policy. And currently in the UK, we're not quite there when it comes to harnessing the full potential of this gold mine of big data on us to help improve our lives and government policy towards our lives.
Controversially, I'd like to kind of say, as we look towards the third sector, when I was asked to kind of moderate this, I thought, if we do things right and we're proactive, then maybe there might not need to be a third sector to solve any ills of society as we transition over. Of course, that's the optimist in me, slightly naive maybe take on the world and the problems that we have. In addition to kind of good use of data to ensure that we don't have societal problems, that the public sector can impact, what are the opportunities in the third sector within this fourth industrial revolution?
Well, I mean, we know again from previous industrial revolutions that the social sector, civil society, charities have played an absolutely fundamental role. In fact, in some ways, the charitable sector grew up to heal some of the social scars that accompanied the first industrial revolution. At the time when people were being displaced from work, their skills were becoming obsolescent, they were finding themselves without shelter or food. The charitable sector grew up to meet the needs of those disadvantaged by that first wave of technology. And given that we know that this fourth wave, its impact on jobs is very likely going to be every bit as great, if not greater, than any of the preceding three, the case for having civil society or social sector charities help soothe and heal those social scars is for me going to be even greater. I'll put differently in the language used by this economist around called Raghu Rajan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He's got a new book out called The Third Pillar. So the first pillar is the market, the second pillar is the state. The third pillar is basically civil society. It is community. And he attributes many of the current problems afflicting society, social disconnection, the breakdown of trust, rising inequality, to a chronic neglect of the third pillar, a deconstruction, if you like, of the third pillar. And if ever there were a time to be resurrecting it, to tackle those problems of community disconnection, of lack of trust, of rising inequality, it is now. So I would see, although it would be nice if we didn't have to have a charitable sector, I think the demand for it is going to keep on arising over the next few years.
It's only going to increase. Okay, so given that we can't do away with the charity sector, with the third sector, what are some examples of good use of technology, actually, today that we're seeing that might be things that we take forward as best practice, might be things to learn, might be things that we want to echo as we go forward?
Yeah, I mean, the good news here, as you know, because you've been involved yourself, Anne-Marie, a lot, is the budding, the growing, rapidly growing Tech for Good movement is beginning to transform the business models, not just of private companies and the public sector, but the charity sector as well. Just think of the way in which people go about giving money to charities these days. That's been transformed pretty fundamentally over the last 10 years or so. Through Just Giving, we can do that digitally. We can donate via Alexa. We can tap our contactless card and give directly through Tap for Change or Goodbox. I mean, there's been quite a shift forward in how we give money. There's been a huge shift forward in how we volunteer. So we hear a lot about the gig economy, but the gig economy has hit the volunteering market as well. So many more people now...
Micro-volunteering.
Micro-volunteering, right? Exactly. Giving often a small slither of your time. This is not just giving up a Saturday to go volunteer in an Oxfam, although you should. It can be setting aside 15 minutes to help a blind person read. That too, micro-volunteering, a huge growth area. And increasingly the use of, virtual assistants, chatbots, to offer online support to people in a variety of settings. In this case, 24/7. Instantly available support, albeit through a machine rather than a human, 24/7. So I think that is the good news, and there's plenty of good news for the charity sector to point towards. I think it's not all good news, because in general, the degree of technological penetration in the sector is low.
It's worse than SMEs in the private sector.
Materially worse. I mentioned earlier on this long tail of companies, private companies, that have been largely impervious to technological change. That tail is even longer and even further behind when it comes to the charitable sector. So if we think there's a need to speed up the process of diffusion of all good things technologically to companies, that case is clearly even stronger for charities.
And there's a need for them for efficiency, as well as it's mostly efficiency, really, isn't it, for charities?
And reach.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it can improve the offering they provide to people. It can do it cheaper and more effectively. But crucially, it can help achieve greater digital reach than might otherwise be the case. And we've seen the way in which, for example, fintech has helped democratize and increase the inclusivity of financial offerings. The same is true, I think, on an even larger scale when it comes to charitable offerings.
But the one of the big things that I know you've spoken about before that's holding this back is measurement within the third sector. So something where I think in the private world, even things like GDP and being able to measure performance, you can do with money. With the third sector, there's a bit of a gap or a bit of an opportunity maybe in terms of measurement and how that might be able to then link in to future-proofing.
Quite so. So, I mean, both gap and opportunity, I'd say.
Yeah.
The truth is, 100 years ago, we invented a way of getting our arms around the financial contribution companies make. And out of that grew this concept called GDP. We have made far less progress over the last 100 years to fully understand the contribution the public sector makes. And when it comes to the third sector, civil society, really we've only begun to scratch the surface of measuring the societal contribution that they make. And that's bad news, because out of sight is out of mind. What goes unmeasured tends to go unmanaged. I think there is a big agenda around measurement that needs, for example, case in point. So a few years ago, the Office for National Statistics, who calculate our official numbers, decided to include within this thing called GDP measures of prostitution and drug dealing on the grounds that they involve a monetary transaction, which they do. But when it comes to volunteering, and maybe 15 million people in this country volunteer regularly and formally, because there is no monetary transaction, by definition, all of that work, because work is what it is effectively excluded entirely from our official measures of the economy. So drug dealing and prostitution in, volunteering out when it comes to keeping score. And that doesn't feel right.
It doesn't. And the unpaid work that's done in homes as well,
Exactly
and in caring. So,
Exactly
there's a lot of things that we need to kind of pick up on if we're going to ensure that we're managing the right things going forward into this next revolution.
And although it sounds arid, maybe it is arid, to talk about measurement, it matters. I think without measurement, it's very hard to know how to best to allocate resources, say between private sector, public sector, and between civil society. So I think there's huge scope there to do a somewhat better job.
Okay, so we're getting towards the kind of end of our conversation. They say talk is cheap.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say, what are the actions? What should we be doing? What can we be doing? Especially with an audience like we have at CogX. What should we be doing? What happens next? What's your suggestion?
Well, let me float a couple of boats. And in the spirit of hoping one or two of you in the room might pick up one or two of these ideas and maybe take them forward with me, if you fancy it. Here's one. So when it comes to our weather, discussing the weather, we start with the weather, right? Great strides have been made in improving our ability to measure weather systems in microscopic detail and in close to real time. You get very detailed and very granular weather forecasts, which these days are an order of magnitude more accurate than was the case 20 or 30 years ago. We can monitor and measure our weather systems in close to real time anywhere on the planet. The same is true of our oceans. The same is true of our information systems. The same is true of our supply chains. The same is true of our solar system. The same is actually true of our universe. And yet, we cannot do that when it comes to measuring our economy. We ought to be able, the information is there, the data is there, sometimes within companies, sometimes within governments, to be able to monitor and manage our economy and financial system in close to real time, to create a digital twin of our economy that can be used not just for measuring our economy, but for managing our economy as well. We could make that a reality at CogX, maybe not today, but maybe by this time next year. The second thought, which really is more of a kind of call to action in the audience, is that I've mentioned this long tail of charities that currently are disconnected from technology. 10 years, I set up a charity which is about connecting charities with economists. I'd love to be able to harness the power in this room, the expertise in this room, within the big tech and indeed small tech sector, to put that into charities, to try and lift the fortunes of that long tail, and having them all connected and contributing. I think that's well on the road. What do you think, Anne-Marie? Was that?
I think that's a great idea, Andy. We should call it Techies for Charities.
Techies for Charities.
Yeah, or we could crowdsource the name.
What do you think of that name, by the way?
What do people think of the idea?
You do that?
Would anyone put their hands in or hands up for being a part of it, wanting to contribute? Oh, okay, we've got a couple of you.
One or two more. We'll have to work on you outside. So we're having a meet and greet after
We are having a meet and greet.
So
and this
if
is the agenda has been
taking
set
that
for
forward,
the meet and greet.
I'd love to think about whether we can find a way of curating skilled volunteering tech resource into the charity sector. I can tell you from my experience of the last 10 years with my lot, the economists, I mean, it's fantastic for the charities, but it's even better for the volunteers.
So my action, or my idea that I'd like to bring forward, with the Institute for the Future of Work, Good Work, the Charter for Good Work is something we've been working on for a while. And like I said, we've been focusing on work and the workplace and the private sector, if we want to kind of loop this conversation back to where we started. And it's something where we know that, again, like we said, people are going to have to be proactive about how they are treating these employees while they're at work. What does good work look like? And it's nice to kind of stretch this definition beyond just paid work, but also the kind of unpaid work as well. So the Institute is actually launching today a consultation across private, public sector, and of course the third sector of, who is defining good work. We've got our own 10 principles of good work that we're kind of positing out. But who's defining them? How will we implement them? And how do we prioritize good work? Because I think if we go back to productivity and we go back to where we started, it's also about people feeling fulfilled, feeling empowered in what they're doing, and ensuring that it's not just, the innovators are running away and making all the benefits, and we're kind of leaving everyone else behind. So if any of you are interested in that, it's live now, I think, as we're speaking, on the Institute for the Future of Work's website, ifow.org. Andy and I have already completed it because we got the link yesterday. I'm joking. But there is a consultation as well. But definitely come and join us in the meet and greet just afterwards. I want to end on a thought that I hope kind of summarises what we've said, which is that rising inequality means that the purpose of an economy should be raising standards, human flourishing, and the reduction of poverty concurrently. This is something we need to do all together in one. And if the economy is doing well, we will get there. The robots won't kill us, but they may marry our children. And I'll close it on that. Thank you very much.
Very good.